Germans called America weak, D-Day's scale. 3 years later shocked them. The German officers stared in disbelief at the horizon. What they saw that morning of June 6, 1944 was impossible, according to everything they had been taught to believe. Thousands upon thousands of ships stretched across the English Channel as far as the eye could see. The sky above roared with Allied aircraft in formation so massive they blocked out the dawn. Sunday. This was not the weak, fractured America that Nazi propaganda had promised them. This was something entirely different. This was industrial might on a scale that defied comprehension. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, would file his formal assessment just 2 weeks later. His 3,100-word report identified the primary factor in Allied success with brutal honesty: the enemy's complete mastery in the air. 29,000 Allied sorties in 2.5 days. 300 aircraft daily dive bombing and strafing every movement on the ground, even a single soldier. The movement of tanks by day in open country had become impossible. What von Rundstedt witnessed that June morning was the physical manifestation of a catastrophic German miscalculation that began 3 years earlier. On the night of January 8th to 9th, 1942, Adolf Hitler sat in his headquarters and delivered one of his evening monologues. His words were recorded by Heinrich Heim and Martin Bormann for what would become known as Hitler's Table Talk. The Führer spoke with absolute certainty about America. Everything about the behavior of American society reveals that it is half Judaized and the other half negrified, he declared. How can one expect a state like that to hold together? A state where 80% of the revenue is drained away for the public purse. A country where everything is built on the dollar. This was not casual rhetoric. This was the core of Nazi ideology, the fundamental belief that would shape German strategic planning and ultimately contribute to the Third Reich's destruction. Hitler had expressed similar views publicly 1 month earlier. On December 11, 1941, standing before the Reichstag to declare war on the United States, he proclaimed that all which America did not get from Europe may seem worthy of admiration to a Jewified mixed race. But Europe regards that merely as symptomatic of decay in artistic and cultural life, the product of Jewish or Negroid blood mixture. The Nazi leadership genuinely believed these racial theories. They convinced themselves that racial diversity weakened nations, that Jewish influence corrupted societies, that democracy made countries militarily impotent. These were not cynical lies told only to the German public. They were the core beliefs that shaped German strategic assessment of their enemies and their own capabilities. For years, Nazi propaganda had systematically portrayed America as a nation in terminal decline. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, orchestrated a relentless campaign through his weekly newspaper, Der Reich. On August 9, 1942, Goebbels ridiculed America as God's country. Were it left to its own resources, he wrote, it would soon return once more to desert and prairie, as wide and as empty as the souls of its people. He portrayed America as dependent on European civilization for everything of value. A young land lacking culture, education, and history. Goebbels attacked American military leadership with particular venom. His June 7, 1942 article, Heroes and Film Heroes, specifically targeted General Douglas MacArthur as a coward for leaving Bataan before the April 10, 1942 surrender, comparing MacArthur unfavorably to German General Scherer, whose unit held out for 107 days while cut off. Goebbels concluded that the momentary fame of American film heroes will have melted along with the wax in Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. Hermann Göring, as Reich Marshal and head of the Luftwaffe, epitomized this dismissive attitude with his famous claim that Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades. They would never be able to produce the military equipment and supplies necessary to defeat Nazi Germany, he insisted. This was not mere wartime bluster. It reflected genuine German leadership belief in American industrial incapability. The propaganda themes remained consistent. Racial mongrelization made America weak. Jewish control corrupted its leadership. Plutocratic capitalism divided its people. American soldiers lacked the fighting spirit of German troops. German newspapers ran cartoons showing President Franklin Roosevelt with exaggerated Jewish features, suggesting he was merely a puppet of international Jewish conspirators. Magazine covers depicted American cities as cesspools of moral decay, where jazz music, which the Nazis associated with Black Americans, had supposedly poisoned the culture beyond repair. The narrative was simple and seductive to those who wanted to believe it. America had no unified national character, no pure racial identity to rally around. How could such a mongrel nation possibly challenge the racially homogeneous and ideologically unified German Reich? The Wehrmacht officers believed it. The German people believed it. Even as America entered the war in December 1941, the Nazi leadership remained confident that this soft, divided democracy would crumble when faced with the hardened warriors of the Third Reich. German military planners had studied American performance in World War I and drawn dismissive conclusions. Yes, America had eventually sent troops to Europe in 1917 and 1918, but those soldiers had required extensive training from French and British forces before they were considered battle-ready. The United States Army of 1918 numbered fewer than 200,000 men before the draft. Surely the Nazis reasoned, this was not a nation built for modern mechanized warfare. Hitler himself had expressed nothing but contempt for American military potential. In private conversations with his inner circle, he mocked the idea that Americans could manufacture quality weapons or field-disciplined armies. He pointed to what he saw as American obsession with comfort and entertainment. How could a nation addicted to Hollywood movies and consumer goods possibly develop the martial spirit necessary for total war? The Führer's worldview simply could not accommodate the possibility that a multi-ethnic democracy might possess strategic advantages that his racially pure dictatorship lacked. When Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, he did so with a strange mixture of inevitability and disdain. He viewed the declaration as merely formalizing a state of war that Roosevelt had been waging covertly for months through Lend-Lease aid to Britain and aggressive naval patrols in the Atlantic. But Hitler's calculus was fundamentally flawed. He assumed that America, already committed to war with Japan in the Pacific, would be unable to mount significant operations in Europe for years. By that time, he believed Germany would have secured victory over the Soviet Union and consolidated an impregnable fortress Europe. The German war planners made lists of everything America supposedly lacked: military tradition, professional officer corps, combat experience, modern armor, strategic bombers. The list went on and on. What the planners failed to understand was that America's weaknesses were temporary, while its strengths were structural and enormous. The United States possessed something Germany desperately needed, but could never have enough of: resources and industrial capacity on a continental scale. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, the Nazi leadership watched with growing unease as reports filtered back from North Africa. American soldiers, green and inexperienced, had initially stumbled. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm German superiority. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps inflicted a devastating defeat on American forces in the Tunisian mountains. The casualty figures appeared to validate every Nazi stereotype. 6,300 American casualties, including 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing or captured. German forces suffered only 989 casualties, with 201 killed, 536 wounded, and 252 missing. American material losses were staggering: 183 tanks lost, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and 512 trucks destroyed or captured. German forces captured 57,000 gallons of gasoline and 45 tons of ammunition. German propaganda seized on Kasserine Pass as proof that American soldiers lacked fighting spirit. Nazi newspapers proclaimed that American troops broke and ran when faced with professional German soldiers. Radio broadcasts mocked American military competence. Goebbels declared that this was what happened when a mongrel nation tried to fight a war against warriors with pure blood and iron will. But experienced German officers noticed something troubling in the aftermath. Rommel himself recognized what Nazi propagandists chose to ignore. In his journal, he wrote that the tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points. Later in the Rommel papers, he acknowledged even more. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. Rommel wrote, "Although we had to wait until the Pétain army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare, the Desert Fox, one of Germany's most capable commanders, had recognized something that Hitler and Goebbels refused to see. The Americans learned quickly. They adapted their tactics. And most alarming of all, their equipment was arriving in staggering quantities. By May 1943, just 3 months after Kasserine Pass, American forces had driven Axis armies completely from North Africa. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers in Tunisia. The lesson of Kasserine Pass was not American incompetence. It was American adaptability. The ability to learn from defeat, reorganize rapidly, and return stronger was precisely the kind of flexibility that authoritarian systems struggled to match. While Nazi propaganda continued to mock American industrial capacity, the reality unfolding across the Atlantic was staggering beyond comprehension. The numbers were so extreme that German intelligence officers who reported them were sometimes accused of exaggeration or defeatism. But the numbers were real, verified, and growing every month. In 1943 alone, America produced 29,497 tanks. This figure excluded other armored fighting vehicles. Total armored fighting vehicle production for 1943 reached 37,198 units. To provide perspective, Germany produced 26,125 tanks during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. America built more tanks in 1 year than Germany managed in 6 years of total war. The Sherman tank became a symbol of the gap between German perceptions and American reality. German tankers initially dismissed the Sherman as inferior to their Panzer Mark IV and the fearsome Tiger tanks. The Sherman had thinner armor, a less powerful gun, and caught fire more easily when hit. German crews nicknamed it the Ronson after a cigarette lighter because it supposedly lit up on the first strike. But when German forces captured a Sherman called War Daddy II from 1st Armored Division on February 22, 1943 in Tunisia, they shipped it to Kumdorf Weapon Testing Center for detailed evaluation. The German technical assessment contradicted the propaganda. The Sherman was well built, reliable, and comfortable. German engineers noted it was superior in reliability to German tanks and described it as an automotive masterpiece the Germans could only dream of producing. What German tankers failed to appreciate was the strategic implication of American mass production. For every Tiger tank Germany produced, America was producing dozens of Shermans. Quality matters in individual tank duels, but quantity determines who wins campaigns. A Tiger might destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out, but if America could field 20 Shermans for every Tiger, the mathematics of attrition favored the Allies overwhelmingly. German units actually sought out captured Shermans for their own use, particularly converting them to armored recovery vehicles. Tank recovery units in Italy preferred captured Shermans specifically because of their extraordinary reliability, compared to German vehicles that broke down constantly. A German Africa Corps War Diary entry from November 2, 1942, noted that American-built tanks have an advantage over German tanks because they can successfully conduct a firefight at distances of over 1,000 m. Aircraft production told an even more dramatic story. In 1943 alone, America produced 84,153 aircraft, including 9,574 heavy bombers, 7,256 medium bombers, and 23,621 fighters. By 1944, production peaked at 96,270 aircraft. This was more than Japan produced during the entire war, which totaled 76,320 aircraft from 1939 to 1945. American aircraft factories operated 3 shifts, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Women who had never worked in factories before learned to rivet aluminum, install hydraulic systems, and assemble complex instruments. By 1943, women comprised 65% of the aircraft industry workforce, up from 1% before the war. The iconic Rosie the Riveter represented hundreds of thousands of real women whose labor made American air superiority possible. The Ford Motor Company built a massive plant at Willow Run, Michigan, specifically designed to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers. The factory sprawled across 5 million square ft, making it the largest single production facility under one roof in the world. At peak production, Willow Run employed 42,000 workers, including over 15,000 women. The B-24 Liberator was an extraordinarily complex machine. It contained 1,550,000 parts compared to approximately 15,000 parts in an automobile. Yet Ford's assembly line techniques adapted for aircraft production achieved mass production rates that military planners had considered impossible. At maximum production in 1944, Willow Run produced one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Peak monthly production reached 428 bombers in April 1944. Total Willow Run production reached 8,685 B-24s, representing nearly half of all B-24s built by all manufacturers combined. These bombers would pound German industrial capacity, destroy transportation networks, and establish the air superiority that would make D-Day possible. Ford workers building bombers at Willow Run were fighting the war as surely as pilots flying them over Europe. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial innovation applied to naval construction. Initial Liberty Ship construction took 230 to 355 days in 1941 through systematic improvement of mass production techniques pioneered by industrialist Henry Kaiser. Average construction time dropped to 30 to 42 days by 1943. The record holder SS Robert E. Peary launched in exactly 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes from Kiel, laying on November 8 to November 12, 1942, while this was partially a propaganda achievement with significant fitting out work completed after launch. Regular production still maintained extraordinary pace. By 1943, America launched 3 Liberty ships every single day. Total Liberty ship production reached 2,110 vessels from 1941 to 1945. These ships carried the supplies that kept Allied armies fighting. They transported tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, and the millions of tons of material necessary for modern warfare. German U-boats sank Allied merchant ships by the hundreds, but American shipyards replaced losses faster than submarines could sink them. Admiral Karl Donitz watched his strategy of starving Britain into submission collapse under the weight of American shipbuilding. The scale of American production extended across every category of military equipment. By 1944, the United States produced 2 to 3 of all Allied military equipment, 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. More than half of all industrial production in the world occurred in the United States by war's end. American artillery particularly impressed German commanders who experienced it firsthand. RML wrote to his wife on February 18, 1943 during the Kasserine Pass battle, noting the effectiveness of American artillery. An observation plane directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone, he observed. German generals consistently noted that American artillery was more mobile, larger caliber, longer ranged, and better supplied than German equivalents. Once proximity fuses were deployed, American artillery became utterly devastating in effect. These fuses, developed in secret, used miniature radar to detonate shells at optimal height above ground, dramatically increasing lethality against infantry and unarmored vehicles. German soldiers learned to fear American artillery above almost any other weapon. The sheer volume of American shell production meant that American artillery could fire at rates German gunners could only dream of matching. The M1 Garand rifle gave individual American soldiers significant firepower advantages over German troops equipped with bolt-action KR-98K Mausers. While German units compensated with higher densities of machine guns and submachine guns, the semi-automatic M1 allowed American riflemen to maintain sustained fire rates impossible with bolt-action weapons. General George Patton famously called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. Nazi ideology had insisted that American industrial capacity was exaggerated propaganda, that American workers were too soft and undisciplined to match German production, that Jewish influence and racial mixing had corrupted American society beyond military effectiveness. Every single one of these assumptions was catastrophically wrong. American democracy, messy, contentious, proved more resilient and adaptable than German dictatorship. American mass production techniques developed for consumer goods translated brilliantly to weapons manufacture. American diversity, which Nazis viewed as fatal weakness, became a source of strength that Germany could not match. The proof lay not in propaganda, but in the diversity of Americans who built and wielded the arsenal of democracy. The very people Hitler dismissed as racial inferiors demonstrated capabilities that shattered Nazi racial theories completely. African American soldiers, whom Nazi propaganda portrayed as subhuman, proved their courage and competence on battlefields across Europe. The Tuskegee Airmen shattered every racist assumption about Black Americans' capabilities. Of 992 pilots trained from 1941 to 1946, 450 deployed overseas, flying 1,178 combat missions and over 15,000 combat sorties. The Tuskegee Airmen destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in air combat, 150 on the ground, and damaged 148 more. Most remarkably, they lost only 27 bombers on escort missions, compared to an average of 46 for other P-51 groups. This was the lowest loss rate of any escort fighter group. Bomber crews specifically requested the Tuskegee Airmen as escorts because they knew these black pilots would protect them. The unit earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, and 744 air medals. 3 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action. 3 became prisoners of war, and 21 received the Distinguished Flying Cross. These were the men that Hitler's racial ideology insisted were incapable of mastering complex machinery or showing martial courage. Reality proved Hitler catastrophically wrong. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, attached to General George Patton's Third Army in October 1944. They fought 183 consecutive days in combat, participating in 4 major Allied campaigns. They breached the Siegfried Line, liberated over 30 towns, and were among the first American units to meet Soviet forces in Austria. The battalion suffered approaching 50% casualties while inflicting an estimated 130,000 casualties on German forces. They earned 1 Medal of Honor awarded in 1997, 11 Silver Stars and approximately 300 Purple Hearts, plus a Presidential Unit Citation awarded in 1978, 33 years after the war. Patton, who had expressed racist views earlier in his career, came to respect the Black Panthers' fighting ability and relied on them in critical operations. The 92nd Infantry Division, the only African-American infantry division in European combat, fielded approximately 15,000 officers and men fighting in Italy from October 1944 through May 1945. They suffered roughly 3,000 casualties, including over 400 killed, 1,500 wounded, and 500 missing or prisoners of war. The unit earned 2 Medals of Honor, both awarded in 1997, 5 decades after the war, 208 Silver Stars, 1,166 Bronze Stars, and 1,891 Purple Hearts. They liberated the Italian cities of La Spezia and Genoa. The Red Ball Express represented one of the most critical, yet least celebrated contributions to Allied victory. This truck convoy system, 75% African-American drivers totaling approximately 23,000 personnel, transported 12,193 tons of supplies over 82 days from August 25 to November 16, 1944. They hauled supplies from Normandy beaches to rapidly advancing front lines. At peak operation, 6,000 trucks transported 12,500 tons daily. Drivers worked around the clock in shifts, maintaining momentum even when exhausted. General Patton called the 212-ton truck our most valuable weapon, acknowledging that his rapid advance across France depended entirely on this supply lifeline. Without the predominantly black drivers of the Red Ball Express, Patton's tanks would have run out of fuel and ammunition within days. Overall, approximately 1 million to 2 million African Americans served in the armed forces during World War II out of 5 million registered for the draft. This included approximately 1 million in the United States Army, 167,000 in the Navy, 17,000 in the Marine Corps, and 4,000 African American women in the WAC. These soldiers served in a segregated military, facing discrimination and prejudice even while fighting for their country. Yet they served with distinction and courage, proving through action what Nazi racial ideology denied. They were not inferior. They were not incapable. They were Americans who loved their country and fought to defend it, even when that country did not yet grant them full equality. Jewish scientists fleeing Nazi persecution built the most devastating weapon in human history, the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project's roster reads like a catalog of refugees from Hitler's racial policies. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed the project. Leo Szilard co-authored Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt and conducted the first controlled nuclear chain reaction with Enrico Fermi. Albert Einstein's theories provided the theoretical foundation. Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, John von Neumann, Felix Bloch, Otto Fr., Rudolf Piles, Eugene Wiener, and Richard Feynman were among dozens of Jewish scientists whose brilliance Hitler had forced into exile. These men, whom Nazi ideology classified as subhuman parasites corrupting German society, developed the weapon that would make American victory absolute. A contemporary observer noted that the vast majority of the Manhattan Project scientists were Jewish, and almost all of them were German, Hungarian, or Austrian refugees fleeing Nazi racial policies. Nazi ideology literally drove the scientific talent that would develop the war's most decisive weapon into American hands. Hitler's racial theories had created his own worst nightmare, a Jewish scientific brain trust working for America. The final bitter irony was complete. Nazi Germany expelled the scientists who might have given them atomic weapons first. Those same scientists, welcomed by America's pluralistic society, built the bomb that ensured Hitler's regime would be utterly destroyed. Ideology divorced from reality had led Germany to arm its greatest enemy with its most talented minds. Native American code talkers provided unbreakable battlefield communications that baffled enemy intelligence throughout the war. Approximately 400 to 420 Navajo Marines developed and used a code based on their native language. Japanese cryptographers, among the world's best, never broke the Navajo code despite intensive efforts. They could not even identify what language was being spoken. At Aoima, 6 Navajo code talkers sent and received over 800 messages in the first 2 days of the battle, all without error. Major Howard Connor, signal officer at Iwo later stated bluntly that were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo. Beyond the Navajo, approximately 534 total Native American code talkers from 14 to 15 different tribes served in both European and Pacific theaters. 14 Comanche code talkers served in Europe and participated in the Normandy invasion. They provided secure communications during the Utah beach landing and subsequent operations, transmitting messages about German positions, troop movements, and tactical situations that could not be intercepted and decoded. The supposedly racially inferior Native Americans had created a communication system that the most sophisticated enemy intelligence could not crack. Japanese American soldiers proved their loyalty and courage, despite suffering the injustice of internment camps that imprisoned their families. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in United States military history. According to official Army designation, the statistics are extraordinary. 21 Medals of Honor with 20 upgraded in 2001 original awarded during the war, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 9,486 Purple Hearts. Over 18,000 individual decorations total from a unit that began with 4,000 men. The 442nd suffered a 314% casualty rate, meaning the unit had to be replaced more than 3 times over. From an original strength of 4,000 men, approximately 14,000 to 18,000 served in the 442nd during the war, with 680 plus killed in action. The rescue of the Lost Battalion in October 1944 exemplifies their sacrifice. When 211 soldiers from the 141st Regiment of the 36th Texas Division were surrounded in the Vosges Mountains, the 402nd was ordered to break through German lines and rescue them. Over 5 days from October 26 to 30th, 1944, the 402nd suffered over 800 casualties, more than 140 were killed, and over 600 wounded to rescue 211 trapped men. Company K was reduced to 17 riflemen. Company I was reduced to 8 riflemen. The unit received 5 Presidential Unit Citations in 20 days for actions designated as one of the top 10 battles in United States Army history. These Japanese-American soldiers fought with extraordinary courage while their families were imprisoned behind barbed wire in internment camps in the American West. They fought not because they were treated fairly, but because they loved their country and wanted to prove their loyalty. Nazi racial ideology insisted that racial mixing and diversity made nations weak. The 442nd proved that loyalty and courage have nothing to do with racial purity. Hispanic Americans served in numbers disproportionate to their population. An estimated 400,000 to 500,000 Hispanic Americans served in the military, despite constituting a smaller percentage of the total United States population. Company E of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Division, was an entirely Mexican-American unit from El Paso, Texas. Company E was among the first American troops to land in Italy at Senio. During the disastrous Rapido River crossing on January 20th to 22nd, 1944, of 154 men who crossed the river, Only 27 returned. The unit was virtually destroyed fighting at one of the war's most costly river crossings. Those who survived continued fighting at Monte Cassino and throughout the brutal Italian campaign, demonstrating courage and tenacity that matched any unit in the American Army. Women transformed American war production from an impossibility to reality. The female workforce increased from 27% in 1940 to 36 to 37% in 1945. Approximately 6 million women entered the workforce during the war years. In aircraft manufacturing, women comprised 65% of the industry workforce by 1943, up from 1% before the war. At Willow Run's B-24 bomber plant, up to 1/3 of the 42,000-person workforce were women. More than 15,000 female workers built the bombers that would pound German positions in Normandy and across occupied Europe. These women learned complex industrial skills, operated heavy machinery, read technical blueprints, and maintained quality control on weapon systems that required precision manufacturing. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic symbol, but she represented real women with real skills doing essential work. They welded steel, assembled engines, installed electrical systems, and tested aircraft. They worked in shipyards building Liberty ships and destroyers. They manufactured ammunition, assembled rifles, and packed parachutes. Without women workers, American industrial production could never have reached the levels that overwhelmed German capacity. American production did not only equip American forces. Through the Lend-Lease program, America became the arsenal of democracy for all Allied nations. The scale of American aid to Britain and the Soviet Union demonstrated industrial capacity that German planners had insisted was impossible. Britain received over $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid, equivalent to approximately $540 billion in current value. This included aircraft, tanks, trucks, food, raw materials, and industrial equipment. Without American supplies, Britain could not have continued the war after 1941. The Royal Air Force flew American-built aircraft. British soldiers drove American trucks. British civilians ate food shipped from America. British factories processed American raw materials into finished weapons. The Soviet Union received over $11 billion in Lend-Lease aid, equivalent to approximately $190 billion today, $49,000 trucks and jeeps, 12,000 armored vehicles including 7,000 tanks, 11,000 aircraft, 75 million tons of food, enough to provide half a pound of food daily to every Soviet soldier for the entire war, 15 million pairs of boots, 13 million in winter coats. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the final assault on Berlin, acknowledged after the war that without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. The Red Army's mobility in its great offensives from 1943 to 1945 depended heavily on American Studebaker trucks. Soviet factories focused on producing tanks and artillery, while American industry provided transport and logistics support. American industrial production supported not just American forces, but the entire Allied war effort. Stalin himself, despite his complicated relationship with the West, admitted in a 1943 toast that without American production, the Allies would have lost the war. Even allowing for diplomatic exaggeration, the fundamental point remained valid. American industrial capacity was sustaining three major Allied powers simultaneously, while also fighting a two-front war against Germany and Japan. German intelligence officers knew these numbers. They read reports of American production statistics and Lend-Lease shipments, but Nazi ideology provided a framework that reinterpreted the evidence. The numbers must be exaggerated, they reasoned. American production was supposedly inferior quality. Allied unity would crack under pressure. The Allies would eventually turn on each other, especially the capitalist democracies and the Communist Soviet Union. Every assumption proved wrong. American production numbers were not exaggerated, but actually understated in some categories. American equipment quality was generally excellent, often superior to German equivalents in reliability and ease of production. Allied unity held together despite tensions because all three major powers recognized that defeating Nazi Germany was essential to their survival. And the supposedly impossible feat of supplying multiple Allied nations while fielding massive American forces was accomplished through systematic industrial organization and logistical planning that German authorities had believed no day-to-day democracy could achieve. The German intelligence failure extended beyond the immediate invasion. Throughout 1943 and 1944, German military intelligence received accurate reports of American production capacity, force buildup in Britain, and invasion preparations. The numbers were available. The evidence was clear. But at every level of command, Nazi ideology filtered the interpretation of intelligence. Reports of American production were dismissed as Allied propaganda, designed to intimidate Germany. When intelligence officers reported that America produced nearly 30,000 tanks in 1943 alone, senior commanders refused to believe it. That number exceeded total German production for the entire war. It must be exaggerated, they reasoned, or it must include training vehicles and obsolete equipment. It could not possibly represent genuine combat-capable armor. When reconnaissance flights photographed endless rows of Liberty ships in American ports, the photographs were analyzed, but the implications were dismissed. Yes, America built ships quickly, but surely they were poorly constructed, liable to break apart in rough seas. German naval intelligence knew better. They had captured American equipment and tested it. But ideology overrode evidence at command levels where strategic decisions were made. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, provided detailed and often accurate intelligence throughout the war. But Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who headed the Abwehr, was himself increasingly disillusioned with Nazi leadership. The intelligence his service provided was systematically disregarded when it contradicted Nazi assumptions about enemy capabilities. By 1944, accurate intelligence that might have helped Germany respond more effectively to Allied operations was being ignored or reinterpreted to fit ideological preconceptions. This pattern of ignoring contradictory evidence was not unique to Nazi Germany, but the consequences were particularly severe in this case. When your ideology tells you that racially diverse democracies cannot effectively wage war, and the evidence shows them mobilizing unprecedented industrial and military power, you face a choice. Accept the evidence and revise your ideology, or reject the evidence and maintain your beliefs. Nazi leadership consistently chose the latter and paid for it with total defeat. Nazi racial ideology insisted that diversity equaled weakness, that racial mixing produced inferior soldiers, that Jewish influence corrupted nations, that women belonged only in traditional domestic roles. American reality systematically disproved every single claim. The very diversity Nazis mocked became a strategic advantage that monolithic, racially pure Nazi Germany could never match. Japanese Americans who spoke Japanese staffed military intelligence, translating captured documents and intercepted communications. Navajo Marines provided unbreakable battlefield communications. Jewish refugee scientists built atomic weapons. African American drivers kept Pattern's army supplied with fuel and ammunition. Women built the aircraft and ships that achieved Allied air and naval superiority. Hispanic Americans fought and died in the Italian mountains. Native Americans transmitted secure tactical communications. America's pluralistic society mobilized talents and perspectives that Germany's racial ideology made impossible. Every principle of Nazi racial theory translated into strategic disadvantage. Every assumption about diversity as weakness proved catastrophically wrong. The half-Judaisted and half-negrified nation that Hitler dismissed had become an industrial and military colossus that Germany had no hope of defeating. Before D-Day, German defenders had already experienced American industrial might through the strategic bombing campaign. From 1943 onward, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators pounded German cities and industrial centers in daylight raids while British bombers struck at night. The 8th Air Force based in England grew from a handful of bombers in 1942 to over 200,000 personnel and thousands of heavy bombers by 1944. On single raids, the 8th Air Force could dispatch over 1,000 heavy bombers escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustang fighters. Each bomber carried up to 8,000 lb of bombs. A 1,000-bomber raid delivered 8 million pounds of high explosives on German targets in a single mission. German industrial workers experienced American air power firsthand as factories were systematically destroyed. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the aircraft factories at Regensburg, the synthetic oil refineries that Germany desperately needed. Raid after raid, month after month, American bombers and their crews paid a terrible price in blood. But the cumulative effect was devastating to German war production. By spring 1944, German soldiers in Normandy fortifications could look up and see American bombers passing overhead on their way to Germany. Hundreds of aircraft in tight formations, silver dots against blue sky, heading east to drop tons of explosives on German cities. Those bombers represented the same industrial capacity that would soon deliver an invasion force larger than anything in history. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, had been ground down by attrition. Experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Manufacturing could not keep pace with losses. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, unable to contest Allied air superiority over France. German defenders in Normandy knew what Allied air supremacy meant. They had seen it in North Africa, where Rommel's forces were pounded from the air. They had seen it in Italy, where Allied fighter bombers destroyed German supply columns, and they had experienced it themselves as Allied aircraft ranged freely over France, attacking any target that moved. The sky belonged to the Allies, and everyone knew it. By spring 1944, the question was not whether the Allies would invade France, but when and where. German intelligence knew an invasion was coming. Rommel and von Rundstedt disagreed on defensive strategy, but agreed that stopping the invasion at the beaches was essential. If the Allies established a firm beachhead and broke out into France, Germany lacked the resources to push them back. RML wanted Panzer divisions positioned close to the coast to counterattack immediately. Von Rundstedt preferred holding armor in reserve to counterattack once the invasion location was confirmed. Both strategies might have worked if Germany possessed air superiority and freedom of movement. But Rommel recognized what von had initially underestimated. Allied air superiority would make large-scale armored movement suicidal. In his pre-invasion assessment, RML wrote prophetically about Allied air power. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. This was not pessimism but realism. RML had experienced Allied air power in North Africa and knew what was coming. On June 5, 1944, weather forecasts predicted 2 weeks of conditions unsuitable for invasion. High winds, rough seas, and heavy clouds would make large-scale amphibious operations impossible. RML, believing the weather provided a window of safety, left France to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday on June 6. Many German officers relaxed their vigilance, convinced that invasion was not imminent. German intelligence intercepted Allied code messages on June 1st and June 5th. The first 2 lines of Verlaine's poem Chanson d'Âme had been identified by Admiral Canaris as the signal for invasion within 48 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Mir alerted 15th Army, telephoned Rommel's and von Rundstedt's headquarters, and teletyped General Jodl. The chain of command failed catastrophically. Jodl did nothing, assuming von Rundstedt was alerted. Von Rundstedt did nothing, assuming Rommel was alerted. RML either never received the warning or was focused on his wife's birthday. The 15th Army went on alert, but took no significant action. Other commands received no proper warning. The only German forces fully alerted to imminent invasion through intelligence that proved completely accurate failed to act because each level of command assumed someone else was handling it. But Allied meteorologists had identified a brief window of marginally acceptable weather on June 6th. General Dwight Eisenhower made the decision to go. The invasion was on. In the darkness before dawn on June 6, 1944, over 23,000 Allied airborne troops dropped into Normandy or arrived by glider. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped over the Cotentin Peninsula behind Utah Beach. British and Canadian paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division secured the eastern flank near Caen. Their mission was to secure key bridges, disable coastal batteries, and disrupt German reinforcements. The airborne drops were scattered and chaotic. High winds and German anti-aircraft fire dispersed paratroopers across miles of Norman countryside. Some landed in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others landed far from their designated zones and had to navigate enemy territory in darkness. Despite the chaos, small groups of paratroopers accomplished critical objectives, seizing bridges and blocking roads that would have allowed rapid German reinforcement of the beaches. At 5:45, still before dawn, naval bombardment began. 84 warships plus dozens of landing craft equipped with guns and rockets opened fire on German coastal defenses. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous thunder of explosions that shook the earth and shattered the pre-dawn darkness. USS Nevada, which had been damaged at Pearl Harbor and returned to service, fired 337 rounds of 14-inch shells and nearly 2,700 rounds from 5-inch guns at Utah Beach alone. HMS Belfast would fire over 4,006-inch shells over 33 days of support operations. HMS Ramillies fired over 1,000 shells from 15 in main armament. By June 18th, German defenders and their fortifications experienced bombardment unlike anything they had encountered. Concrete bunkers shook and cracked. Communications lines were severed. Defensive positions were obliterated. At 06:30, the first assault waves hit the beaches. 132-715 seaborne troops would land on 5 beaches that day. The Americans assaulted Utah Beach on the Cottontail Peninsula and Omaha Beach between Verville and Seville. The British attacked Golden Sword beaches. The Canadians landed on Juno Beach. Each beach presented unique challenges and different levels of resistance. Utah Beach proved the least costly. Strong currents pushed landing craft 2,000 RYD south of the planned landing site, accidentally avoiding the heaviest German defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of President Theodore Roosevelt, and at 56 the oldest man in the assault force, led the 4th Infantry Division ashore. When he realized they had landed in the wrong location, he famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Utah Beach casualties were remarkably light. Fewer than 200 killed, wounded, or missing out of over 23,000 troops landed. The accidental landing location, combined with effective naval gunfire support and the rapid advance of troops from the beach, allowed American forces to quickly link up with paratroopers inland and secure the western flank of the invasion. Omaha Beach became the bloodiest and most difficult landing. German defenses at Omaha were more extensive than intelligence had predicted. The 302nd Infantry Division defending Omaha was a higher quality unit than most static coastal divisions. Cliffs overlooked the beach, providing German defenders with commanding fields of fire. Rough seas swamped many landing craft and tanks equipped with flotation devices. The first assault waves at Omaha suffered devastating casualties. German machine gun and artillery fire swept the beach. Men huddled behind beach obstacles in the seawall, pinned down and unable to advance. Landing craft continued bringing reinforcements into a killing zone. For several hours it appeared the Omaha Beach assault might fail completely. Commanders offshore considered evacuating survivors and shifting follow-on waves to other beaches. But small groups of American soldiers led by junior officers and sergeants began advancing up the bluffs. Engineers cleared obstacles despite heavy casualties. Naval destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, sometimes grounding themselves to provide direct fire support. Slowly, painfully, American forces clawed their way off Omaha Beach and secured the heights overlooking the state landing area. By day's end, approximately 2,400 American casualties had been suffered at Omaha, but the beach was secured. The British and Canadian landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches faced varying levels of resistance. Gold Beach saw moderate opposition overcome by veteran British troops. Juno Beach presented difficult conditions with offshore reefs and strong defenses, but Canadian forces pushed inland rapidly once they cleared the beaches. Sword Beach, closest to Caen, faced determined German resistance, but British forces established a solid beachhead. Overhead, Allied air superiority was absolute and devastating. 11 5I-90 Allied aircraft were available on D-Day, including 3,455 operational heavy bombers, 89 operational medium and light bombers, and 3,124 operational fighters. These aircraft flew 14,674 sorties on D-Day alone. For comparison, the Luftwaffe could field only 319 to 815 serviceable aircraft in all of Western France. The ratio was approximately 37 Allied sorties for every 1 German sortie. German pilots who attempted to interfere with the invasion were swarmed by Allied fighters. Luftwaffe fighter ace Joseph Priller famously made a single strafing run across Sword Beach with his wingman in the only German air attack on the beaches that day. 2 aircraft against 11,590 German soldiers defending Normandy watched Allied aircraft fill the sky in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. They saw their own positions destroyed by dive bombers. They watched German reinforcements strafed and destroyed on roads leading to the front. They experienced what RML had predicted: Fighting with modern weapons against an enemy in complete command of the air meant fighting with the same handicaps savages faced against modern European troops. The total invasion force comprised 6,139 vessels. This included 1,213 naval combat ships, 4,126 landing ships and landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels. Naval personnel totaled 195,700 sailors from multiple Allied nations. By the end of D-Day, approximately 156,000 to 160,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy, 73,000 Americans, 83,115 British and Canadian. German defenders had been overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of an operation that Nazi ideology had insisted was beyond Allied capability. Germany had nominally 58 divisions in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Approximately 850,000 troops spread over 2,000 mi of coastline, but quality varied dramatically. Many were static divisions lacking transport. About half included Ostbataillon, poor quality units formed from former Soviet prisoners of war pressed into German service. These were not the elite Panzer and infantry divisions that had conquered France in 1940. L'Esquimalt Corps, commanded by General Erich Marx, directly faced all 5 invasion beaches with only 3 divisions, 2 of them static. When the invasion began, Marx understood immediately what was at stake. When ordering Colonel Hermann von Bronichowski to lead 21st Panzer Division's counterattack, Marx stated bluntly, "If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war." The 21st Panzer Division represented the only German armored counterattack on D-Day itself. The division reached the Channel coast around 2000 hours, splitting Juno and Sword beaches. For a brief moment, German tanks had reached the objective, but the division lacked infantry support and reinforcements to exploit its success. Massive Allied naval gunfire targeted any German movement. The sudden appearance of 250 Allied gliders overhead, threatening German rear areas, forced withdrawal by 2100 hours. Hitler slept late on June 6th. Panzer reserves were not released until 1500 hours, a critical 12-hour delay that allowed Allied forces to consolidate their beachheads. The two-sided divided command structure that RML and von Rundstedt had warned about paralyzed German response during the crucial first hours when rapid counterattack might have made a difference. When Chief of Staff General Hans Spidel telephoned RML with news of major Allied landings, RML repeatedly muttered while rushing back to Normandy, "How stupid of me. How stupid of me." He arrived at La Roche-Conn headquarters around 2200 hours on June 6th. By then, 156,000 Allied troops had landed and established beachheads. It was already too late. By the end of June, 850,000 Allied troops, 570,000 tons of supplies and 150,000 vehicles had crossed the Channel. The Germans were outnumbered, outgunned and paralyzed by Allied air and naval superiority. Field Marshal von Rundstedt filed his formal 3,100-word assessment on June 20th, just 2 weeks after D-Day. His report identified the primary factor in Allied success with brutal honesty. The enemy's complete mastery in the air had rendered German defensive doctrine obsolete. Von Rundstedt noted that 29,000 Allied sorties were counted in 2.5 days, as deep as 65 Mariners from the enemy bridgehead. Of these, about 2,300 aircraft a day dive bomb and strafe every movement on the ground, even a single soldier. Allied naval guns had made the movement of tanks by day in open country impossible. The enemy carries the battle right into the home battlefront with his tactical bombers. Von Rundstedt wrote to interrupt supplies and replacements and cause so many casualties in rolling stock and motorized columns that supply and replacements have become a very serious problem. By June 29th, von Rundstedt's frustration boiled over. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Kittler asked, "What shall we do?" von Rundstedt replied with shocking bluntness, "Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do?" He was dismissed July 4th, officially due to age and ill health. In reality, he had recognized what Hitler refused to accept. The war in the West was lost. Germany no longer possessed the military capacity to defeat the forces arrayed against it. In the weeks and months following D-Day, German military commanders continued filing reports that acknowledged their impossible situation. General Erich Marx, who had commanded L'Esquimalt Corps facing all 5 invasion beaches, was killed on June 12th by Allied air attack. He received posthumous oak leaves to his Knight's Cross for his role in containing the Allied invasion during the vital first week. though containing was perhaps too generous a term for the desperate defensive battles that only delayed inevitable Allied victory. Field Marshal Win Rommel attempted to convince Hitler that the war in the West was lost, and that Germany should seek peace before total destruction. On July 15, 1944, RML sent Hitler a personal letter stating that the situation on the Normandy front is growing worse every day and is rapidly approaching a crisis. The unequal struggle is approaching its end. 2 days later, on July 17th, RML's staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter. The attack left RML with severe head injuries that ended his active military service. On October 14, 1944, implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, Rommel was forced to commit suicide. The Desert Fox, who had recognized American capabilities early and whose tactical assessments proved consistently accurate, was destroyed by the regime he had served. Von Rundstedt, dismissed in July for his Makepeace comment, was actually brought back as Commander-in-Chief West in September 1944. Hitler had few other commanders with von Rundstedt's experience, and desperate times called for experienced leadership despite ideological unreliability. Von Rundstedt commanded during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive in the West, which ultimately failed due to the same factors that had doomed German efforts since D-Day: insufficient fuel, limited air support, and overwhelming Allied material superiority. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the evidence of American industrial might was undeniable, even to the most fanatical Nazi believers. American, British, and Soviet forces occupied Germany. German cities lay in ruins from years of Allied bombing. German industry was destroyed. The Wehrmacht was shattered. And everywhere German soldiers looked, they saw American equipment in quantities that made German wartime production appear microscopic by comparison. The transformation from Hitler's January 1942 dismissal of America as half-Judaized and half-negrified to von Rundstedt's June 1944 assessment of complete enemy mastery represented more than military defeat. It demonstrated how ideology, when divorced from empirical reality, produces catastrophic strategic miscalculation. Nazi leaders genuinely believed their racial theories. They convinced themselves that racial diversity weakened nations, that Jewish influence corrupted societies, that democracy made countries militarily impotent, that mass production of consumer goods could not translate to weapons manufacture. These were not cynical propaganda lies. They were core beliefs that shaped German strategic assessment. The evidence of American industrial capacity was available throughout 1942 and 1943. Germany possessed excellent intelligence services. They knew American production numbers, but Nazi ideology provided a framework that reinterpreted evidence. American production was dismissed as inferior quality. American soldiers were dismissed as poorly motivated. American society was dismissed as fundamentally divided and weak. Ideology functioned as a filter that made contradictory evidence invisible or unimportant. By June 6, 1944, reality could no longer be denied or reinterpreted when 156,000 troops landed from 6,139 ships under cover of 11,190 aircraft. When Allied naval guns made German tank movement suicidal. When Allied air superiority achieved ratios of 37-1. When American logistics transported 412,193 tons of supplies over 82 days to sustain rapid advance across France, the gap between Nazi ideology and empirical reality became unsurvivable. RML's pre-invasion prediction proved prophetically accurate. Allied air superiority exposed panzers to devastating fighter-bomber attacks, preventing their movement exactly as he had warned. The strategic debate between RML's armor at the coast strategy and von Rundstedt's armor and reserve strategy became irrelevant when Allied air and naval power made large-scale German armored counterattacks impossible regardless of positioning. The final bitter irony completed the circle of German self-destruction. Nazi racial policies directly strengthened America while weakening Germany. Jewish scientists fleeing persecution built the Manhattan Project that would create atomic weapons. German military intelligence lost countless talented analysts and code reekers to racial purges. The SS diverted scarce military resources to genocide, occupied territories that might have provided willing labor, and even military recruits instead became sources of resistance and partisan warfare. Every principle of Nazi racial ideology translated into strategic disadvantage. Hitler's dismissal of America was not a random insult. It flowed logically from Nazi racial theory. That same theory predicted American collapse, industrial inadequacy, military incompetence, and societal fragmentation. American reality systematically falsified every prediction. The half-Juded and half-negrified nation that Hitler dismissed in January 1942 had become by June 1944. The industrial and military power that German commanders recognized could no longer be defeated. The beaches of Normandy became the graveyard of Nazi illusions. There on the sand and in the surf, German defenders confronted the reality they had denied for so long. America was not weak. Its society was not fractured beyond recovery. Its industrial power was not propaganda but frightening reality. And perhaps most important, the soldiers who came ashore that day, soldiers from every American state and dozens of ethnic backgrounds, fought with courage and determination that equaled anything German soldiers could muster. The German soldiers defending Normandy learned in the most terrible way that propaganda is a poor substitute for truth. The America they had been taught to despise and dismiss was in fact a colossus. The racial diversity they had been told made America weak had made it strong. The democracy they had been assured was chaotic and inefficient had proven itself capable of extraordinary organization and focus. The industrial capacity they had been promised was exaggerated, was, if anything, understated in intelligence reports that had seemed too extreme to believe. D-Day was not the end of the war. 11 months of brutal fighting remained before German surrender in Sated May 1945. German soldiers continued to fight with skill and courage, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The industrial and military might raid against Germany was simply too great. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The fortress of Europe had been entered, and the armies that came ashore in Normandy would not stop until they met Soviet forces in the heart of Berlin. Adolf Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of America as half-Judaized and half-negrified stands as one of history's great miscalculations. Those words spoken with such certainty in January 1942 revealed the fatal flaw at the heart of Nazi ideology. The racial theories that animated the Third Reich prevented German leadership from understanding that strength comes from multiple sources. Industrial capacity, technological innovation, social cohesion, moral purpose, and yes, diversity of talent and perspective. America possessed all these strengths. Nazi Germany, blinded by ideology, could not see them until it was too late. For 3 years from December 1941, when Hitler declared war on America, to June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Nazi leadership had clung to the belief that America's supposed weaknesses would prevent it from playing a decisive role in Europe. Those 3 years allowed America to build the largest military force in its history, supported by the greatest industrial mobilization the world had ever seen. When that force finally arrived on the beaches of Normandy, it arrived with a power that German propaganda had insisted was impossible. The shock that German defenders experienced when they saw the Allied armada approaching Normandy was the shock of reality colliding with ideology. They had believed the propaganda about American weakness. They had accepted the comfortable lie that their racial superiority would guarantee victory. The thousands of ships and aircraft that filled sea and sky that June morning represented truth they could no longer deny. Von Rundstedt's advice to make peace, "You idiots acknowledge the conclusion that evidence," had been screaming since American production began ramping up in 1942. Nazi ideology had led Germany into a war it could not win against, an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. The supposedly weak and divided nation had mobilized power on a scale that dwarfed anything the Third Reich could match. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Ideology divorced from reality, beliefs maintained despite contradictory evidence, strategic planning based on wishful thinking rather than honest assessment. These produce catastrophic failure regardless of how sincerely held the beliefs may be. Nazi racial theory was not just morally abhorrent, it was strategically suicidal. It led German leadership to systematically underestimate their enemies and overestimate their own capabilities. The Americans, British, and Canadians who landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, were not supermen. They were ordinary people from democratic societies who had mobilized their industrial capacity, organized their military forces, and found the courage to cross the channel into the teeth of German defenses. They came from every background, every ethnicity, every region. They proved through victory what Nazi ideology had denied. Diversity is strength. Democracy can fight and win total war. Free societies possess advantages that dictatorships can never match. The German officers who stared in disbelief at the Allied Armada on June 6, 1944, were witnessing the consequences of their leadership's delusions. They had been told for 3 years that America was weak, divided, and incapable of sustained military effort. They had been promised that German superiority would prevail. Instead, they faced an enemy who brought to battle a level of material power that made German resistance ultimately futile. 3 years after Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of the half-Judaized and half-negrified America, his own commanders were advising him to make peace because the war was lost. The scale of American industrial and military power that materialized in Normandy had proved every Nazi assumption catastrophically wrong. Ideology had met reality, and reality had won decisively. The story of Nazi Germany's fatal underestimation of America stands as an enduring warning. Believe your own propaganda at your peril. Ignore evidence that contradicts your worldview at catastrophic cost. Underestimate your enemies based on prejudice rather than realistic assessment, and you may find yourself staring in shock at a horizon filled with ships and aircraft that prove everything you believed was wrong. The officers looking across the English Channel on that June morning in 1944 learned that lesson in the harshest way possible as their world and their ideology crumbled before the overwhelming reality of American power.